Hello, and welcome to another Talking Shop with Covering Climate Now. I'm Mark Hertsgaard. I'm the executive. All right, let's try that again. Hello, I'm Mark Hertsgaard. I'm the executive director of Covering Climate Now, and this is another edition of Talking Shop with Covering Climate Now. Today's subject is climate journalism through a solutions lens, and we're co-partnering on this Talking Shop with the Solutions Journalism Network. Covering Climate Now is a consortium of more than 400 news outlets around the world with a combined audience of roughly 2 billion people. We're organized by journalists for journalists. We help journalists everywhere to do a better job on covering what we call the defining story of our time. It costs nothing to join Covering Climate Now, and there's no editorial line except respect for science. You can sign up to receive our weekly newsletter, join our Slack workspace, and apply to join Covering Climate Now at our website, which of course is coveringclimatenow.org. Now, let me preface today's Talking Shop by saying I know that some of my fellow journalists are perhaps suspicious of the very notion of solutions journalism. So let's be clear here. Solutions journalism is not about cheerleading. It is not about activism. It is not touchy-feely or simple-minded or any of that. It is about seeing and covering a given subject in its entirety, whether that subject is climate change or homelessness or the Israeli-Palestine conflict. It's about reporting the whole story. So the Solutions Journalism Network can help you do that. They're a nonprofit. They train and connect journalists to cover what's missing in the news today, which is so often how people are responding to problems. Since 2013, Solutions Journalism Network has trained 21,000 journalists, more than 500 newsrooms, and they offer a database that tracks more than 11,000 solutions-oriented stories that you can look at and study to see how they do it. And of course, if ever there was a problem that needed a solution, it's climate change. But as journalists, we have to cover solutions professionally, not as advocates of this or that point of view, but as representatives of the public good. It's entirely proper for us to scrutinize proposed solutions and to report on how well they do or do not respond to a given problem, so that citizens and policymakers can make informed decisions. And what's more, and you editors out there should pay special attention here, the research shows that the public actually wants more solutions journalism. One recent poll here in the US found that 83% of the public who were watching a given solution story found it more trustworthy than the conventional problem-oriented story. That only had 55% trustworthiness. So we had an example of solutions journalism, or the need for solutions journalism, I should say, this very week. You may have seen that President Biden's climate envoy, John Kerry, made a comment that, quote, 50%, let me just get this correct, 50% of the carbon reductions needed to get to net zero will come from technologies that haven't been invented yet, unquote. Kerry got pushback from a number of climate experts, including Michael Mann at Penn State University, who argue that the necessary technologies are all here already, but what's needed is the political will to implement them at scale and pace. So who's right? That's the kind of question that solutions journalism is made for. So let's get into it. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. As usual, the first half of the Talking Shop will feature panelists and questions and answers among the panelists. And then the second half will be your questions and hopefully our answers. We've already received some very probing questions in the RSVPs, but please feel free to add more of them in the chat box at the bottom of the page there. And you're also welcome to tweet, of course, during the session using the @CoveringClimate and the CCNow hashtags. Now, please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to our panelists. And first, I'll introduce them all together and then we'll get started. First, Fara Warner. She's the initiatives manager at the Solutions Journalism Network, focused on climate and sustainability. She formerly worked at the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and Fast Company. And in 2020, she was a fellow at the Poynter Institute, working to bring a solutions framework to the climate story. Also joining us, Vania Andre. She's the editor-in-chief of the Haitian Times, which is a leading news outlet for the Haitian diaspora. She's a first-generation Haitian American, and she previously worked for ABC News, for NBC News, and for the New York City Council. And last but not least, Doug Fraser. He's the environment reporter for the Cape Cod Times in Massachusetts, which is owned by the Gannett Company, which is America's largest newspaper publisher. Doug has been a journalist since 1993, and he currently covers climate change and marine issues, including commercial fishing and the big offshore wind project that we're going to talk about a little later off of the Massachusetts coast. We'll start with Fara Warner of the Solutions Journalism Network. Fara, before we talk about John Kerry's remark, I wonder, could you give us just some general background on your network and solutions journalism in general?
Sure, I'd love to. I'm going to switch to some to share my screen because I think visual learning is great. Are we ready for that, Mark?
I think so.
All right, let's jump into it. I normally like to keep things a little bit simple, but I think it'll work best to have some slides. So I just want to, Mark did a great job of explaining who we are, but I want to set sort of a clear intention for what we're going to talk about. Solutions journalism is rigorous. It is evidence-based reporting on responses to social problems. So I just want us to keep that in mind as we go through. Mark, you've already done a nice job of setting us up of where we are today. We did start in 2013 by David Bornstein, Tina Rosenberg, and Courtney Martin. Many of you may know David and Tina. They write the Fixes column for the New York Times. At that time, our mission was to legitimize and spread the practice of solutions journalism. Where we are today is, as Mark said, 21,000 journalists, 500 newsrooms. We do operate around the world in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And our mission now is to scale the practice of solutions journalism. In the chat discussion, just quickly, because I want to bring you guys into this conversation and we can reference these later. What are words or phrases that come to mind when you hear solutions journalism? What do you think when you hear those words? So I'm going to give you just a heartbeat to start putting those into the chat. I can't see the chat, so other people can be keeping track of this, but any words that you, words or phrases that come to mind. Usually we don't do this at Solutions Journalism. We don't start with what solutions journalism isn't, but I do know that there are people out there who are skeptical of what we do. So we're going to start with things that we are not. We are not just an idea or a task force. And Mark already noted the John Kerry saying 50% of carbon reductions needed to come from technologies not yet invented. We aren't about ideas. Instead, we are about something that is already underway. And this is a story from Wisconsin Public Radio about what it is doing. A small Wisconsin city is boosting its use of renewable energy right now. We are not instant activism. I love Lucy Lawless more than anybody else. And great, she's a climate ambassador. She is not the story. The story for us at Solutions Journalism is reporting the responses, not the people. So this is a story from Hot House Solutions, which is from Michael Koren and Jemima Kiss, about retrofitting your home to be more in keeping with electrification. This one I really want to focus on for just 2 seconds. We are not about hero worship. I love CNN heroes as much as anybody, but these are generally not solution stories because they focus on a single person doing a single thing in a single community. Great work, great stories, but we wouldn't call it solutions journalism. Instead, we use character to talk about systemic change. I often say that the solution is the central character in your story, not the person actually implementing it. So it's a clear distinction that we like to make at solutions journalism. These two examples are not climate, but I really wanted to bring them up because we do this occasionally in climate change, is we think that there is a magic bullet. We are not about magic bullet. We are not about good news. We are not about fluff. I think everybody has seen these kinds of stories. They bought him a car, solved one person's problem at one point in time, but may have not solved that problem, the deeper systemic problem of a lack of public transportation in a community. Why do we have to keep giving people cars so that they can get to work? And instead, if you look at the Philadelphia Citizen story, this was about carpooling and getting people to work in a more systemic way. It's also not an afterthought. We can often do this in problem-focused journalism, and many of us who are quote unquote traditional journalists will understand this, which is it's the afterthought or the to be sure paragraph, which is to be sure there's a solution to this. These stories are focused on homelessness, but we can also see them in climate stories. Recently, and not to take Nick Kristof to task, and the stories he told about the young chess player are really beautifully written and good reporting. They are not solutions journalism. Instead, we're looking at responses that make a difference. How do we think about homelessness and the unhoused? What do we need to do on a systems level? So you might be asking, well, then what is solutions journalism? Is it new grant funding? Is it grants, legislation, a task force, an exciting coalition? There's a lot of this happening right now in climate coverage. That's not solutions journalism. Why? Because ideas and theories have no evidence of effectiveness in the real world, although they might point to pilot projects that could be investigated. Plans and promises are just that. They are promises. Without evidence, these are just hope with no teeth. At Solutions Journalism, our motto is hope with teeth. Evidence is absolutely critical in solutions journalism. Colleague of mine made this slide and I absolutely love it. And I think it is really poignant when it comes to covering climate. I will not keep writing the same depressing story over and over and over again. So what is solutions journalism now that I've told you what it isn't? Again, rigorous evidence-based reporting on responses to solutions. It's reporting on something that is happening now and the effects that it is producing. Solutions journalism is a practice, a daily practice for journalists. It is not theory. So here are our 4 pillars of solutions journalism. It features not just a person, but a response to a problem and how it happened. Provides available evidence of results looking at effectiveness, not just intentions. Intentions are lovely, but that's all they are. We are really focused on grounding our stories in evidence-based reporting and especially looking for evidence focused on communities most affected by the problem and the solution. And it seeks to provide insights, lessons learned, replicable models that can help others to respond and not just simply inspire people. And I know we'll come to some questions about advocacy later on, and I will say that evidence, and then the 4th pillar, discussing the limitations, avoids a sounding like a fluff story or greenwashing. We always require, if you submit a story to the story tracker, which you can do, any of your stories, if it does not discuss the limitations, it will not be accepted into the story tracker. Doesn't mean it's not a good story. It just simply won't be accepted into the story tracker. So quickly, and Mark referenced this, why do solutions journalism? And how does telling the whole story create impact? So this is journalism's present theory of change. We are the watchdog. We blow whistles and we expose wrongdoing. We point out social problems and hope that they will spur reform. And I meant to take out that extra will. We are always in this expectation that something will happen. We at Solutions Journalism really believe that we need to not move from the watchdog role all the time, because that is a critical component of who we are as journalists, but to move also to a guide dog role, because it's inadequate for us to simply uncover what's wrong, walk away, and hope society changes. And we do that too often. Put a story out, we walk away, we never come back to it, we never ask the questions, we never ask whether the thing implemented ever actually worked. And we know that people are seeking credible responses to problems. So solutions journalism isn't just about the work that you do on your own, but it can also have a big impact on news organizations and audiences. This comes from a 2019 survey about media engagement, improved perception of article quality, intention to engage, interest and knowledge about the issue. And yes, it does boost readers' positivity. And that's okay, because we've seen this deep decline in people watching and consuming news because they're literally tired of the problem-focused journalism that we're giving them. As Mark noted, we did a recent survey, Smith Geiger Market Research did a survey of 688 participants. 79% said that they wanted problems and effective responses to those problems as either important or essential. So they wanted both, not just one or the other, but actually both. So solutions journalism is absolutely not about producing good news. It is holding people accountable, politicians, companies, governments, those in power, accountable for the responses they bring to social issues. Because if we keep seeing problems as unavoidable, as unsolvable, they will continue to be that. If we flip that script and say, these are unacceptable, the fact that our Earth is where it is at is unacceptable. It is not unavoidable. We know that it's not unavoidable. It's simply unacceptable. And Mark referenced this as well, the percentage of people who trusted the story. In a world in which we are still having conversations about believing in climate change or not, solution stories can really help build trust. So how do you do solutions journalism right now? Normally, this takes us 2 hours to do, and I'm happy to talk to any of you about deeper training. But here's a quick way of doing it. Identify an issue or a question of concern. Ask yourself what's missing from the public conversation. What more should I be looking for? I've looked at the problem. Should I go investigate solutions? So you start hunting for candidates for solutions. And one of the best questions you can ask yourself is who is doing this better? Who's doing it faster, cheaper, more equitably, with better results? Is it more scalable, more replicable? Select a story to highlight, report the story, and focus on the how done it, not the who done it, but the how done it. And finally, just to leave you with this, solutions journalism weighs a response to a problem, looks at how it works, the how done it, it offers insight, it must include limitations, and most importantly, provide evidence of impact to tell the whole story. I love this from Marshall Gans as we end. What leads to change? Combination of a critical eye and a hopeful heart, and an awareness of the world's pain and the world's possibilities. So I'm going to run through these. We do these things. I will share these slides with Covering Climate Now. These are people who are members. You can become a free hub member by going to solutionsjournalism.org. Solution Story Tracker is a great place to start. I'll go quickly back to the Story Tracker. So in addition to the Story Tracker, where if you become a hub member, you can create collections, we also have created some pretty massive collections around climate change that I know we can be dropping into the chat. So it's a great way to start your process of understanding solutions journalism is to read solutions journalism. The hub is where you can get trained. You can connect with us this way. And finally, thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing. And thank you, Mark, for that time. And I'll bring us back here to the room. Thanks.
Yeah, that was absolutely terrific and so instructive and inspiring, really. I thought that, so many of those insights, like let's not just look at the individual, buy that guy a car, but why don't we have public transportation? So let me ask you one quick follow-up. I talked about John Kerry's statement about 50% of the technologies that we need to reach net zero by 2050 aren't here yet, and the pushback from Michael Mann. Would you, in fact, consider that to be an area that could use solutions journalism approach, or did I kind of get that wrong, maybe?
No, I think what John Kerry said was interesting, and I think it was more a call to arms to say there's a lot more work to do. Where I think you could do solutions reporting and investigation there is to go deeper into what he said. Did he focus on any specific areas of technology? Moonshots are important, and we wouldn't have gotten to the moon or to Mars if we hadn't taken those kinds of steps. But I think with solutions journalism, where you start is to say, okay, there's a really interesting technology on the horizon. how did it get there? What are the technologies that help to get us there? Or what are the pilot projects that have got us there? Pilot projects are great to look at because there will be evidence of effectiveness, even if it's qualitative. But we really focus on qualitative and quantitative. So I think what worried me is that the climate conversation turned into a John Kerry's wrong. And that was what led headlines for a few days. We don't have time for that kind of, apologies to anybody who did that coverage or was asked to do that coverage. We don't have time for that.
Let me push back quickly. What about what Michael Mann says that, hey, wait a minute, we have these, and not just Michael Mann, by the way, Drawdown, as you well know, and many others who've been in this space a long time say, wait a minute, that really misstates the situation, sir. We have these technologies. It's a question of changing government policy that we can roll them out quickly enough. Couldn't solutions journalism say, okay, well, what would it take to get those technologies into implementation?
I think those are great solution stories. And so you could take Michael Mann and what he said and others and say, we're doing this, these are stuck in these places. Do those solution stories. And one of the clear limitations is going to be lack of government support. So that's a great way to start really giving rise to what's stopping this from going forward. That makes a really, limitations to me are one of the most powerful parts of a solution story because they show us where we need to make change and where our audience, because audiences can think about putting pressure. We're never saying put pressure here. We're showing you what the limitations are and then letting our audiences sort of say, well, that's interesting. Maybe I should get involved there. I could do something about that. So I think that there's a way to turn this story more positive and towards solutions journalism.
That sounds quite correct. It kind of melds the whole, I loved your image of the watchdog and the guide dog. So it melds that. It's like a watchdog on what Kerry said, and then the guide dog towards, well, here's a lot of evidence that says that, we have these technologies already. So there you are, folks. There's one case study that shows you how solutions journalism can work. Now I'm going to ask Fara to talk about quickly before Vania and Doug come in about the stories that they're doing from a solutions perspective, and then we'll have some Q&A there. Go ahead, Fara.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. It is such my absolute pleasure to have two of my colleagues in the room today. Vania Andre from the Haitian Times. Her work is really centered on plastics pollution and particularly the plastic pollution problem in Haiti. She's investigating HP's projects to recycle plastics and turn them into ink cartridges. We often see this from companies pledging to do these things. And really, Vania has taken an investigative approach to a solution story. So I'm really looking forward to her comments. And then, of course, Doug Fraser, probably landing in one of the biggest stories on renewable energy that we're going to see in the next decade. And that is the green lighting of the Vineyard Wind project off the coast of the Cape. And I know Doug is already hard at work on several solution stories. So I'll turn it back over to you, Mark, to start the questions.
Thanks, Fara. And so we're going to start with Vania. And I apologize for mispronouncing your surname, Vania. Andre. It's Vania Andre, for those of you who are keeping track at home. The Haitian Times reports primarily to Haitians both within Haiti and beyond. And as you know, very unfortunately, Haiti is often depicted in mainstream news coverage, especially here in the US, as just one disaster after another, whether it's poverty or disease or political corruption or violence. And I'm wondering, did that tendency on the part of the mainstream media to kind of pigeonhole Haiti in this disaster zone, did that have any effect on your decision to try and take a solutions journalism approach to this story that Fara just described?
Yes, definitely. First, I just want to say thank you to everyone here for just having me on and the opportunity to talk about our experience with solutions journalism. It definitely was a driving factor for three main reasons. So one, this is what our audience was really asking of us. They were used to seeing a lot of these stories that were highlighting a problem, but didn't necessarily highlight any solutions that were happening. And there was this litany of negative stories that we were covering that we really just wanted to be able to toe the line between giving that type of content, but then also providing insight into these problems, which kind of dovetails into my second point. So, we had a history of really, again, producing stories that our readers deemed as negative. It really necessarily didn't put a positive light on the country. We wanted to move past that and weren't really sure how to do that. And that's where solutions journalism really came in handy, because it first forced us not to just look at the surface problem that we all knew about, and for my story specifically, it's about improper trash disposal in Haiti, but looking at one, why is this a problem that persists? And then two, is there anything that is being done either by the government or outside of the government that is actually working? And then, the third reason why we really wanted to approach this story with that specific framework is because in the past, when we have tried to do our own version, I guess, of solutions journalism, it always would kind of lean towards more feature profiled and go into a little bit of hero worship that I'm sure Fara will get into a little bit later. And that was the tendency we saw. So, we really wanted to take an approach that toed the line between both, that looked at the insight about why this problem existed, but then also highlight a company that was doing this work, but not necessarily fall into this catch of just highlighting all of the positive because they were doing something different that we've seen outside, that we normally see in mainstream media when covering Haiti.
Okay, so now that you've dug into the reporting and using the solutions framework, let's talk some nitty gritty. Where has that been helpful in the reporting, and where has it been maybe more challenging than you expected?
So helpful really was just thinking, it changed the way that I was looking at the story and then thus my reporting. So Farah made a really great point earlier where she mentioned, the solution is really the character of the story. And for me, I've been used to really focusing on the basis of the story, on the problems, and then kind of just expanding through there. And then the solution part of it was really something that came towards the end, as a nice wrap up, but didn't really go into those. So, that's definitely been a positive, basically focusing and flipping my attention otherwise and really looking for the evidence that the solution is working and not the evidence that there's a problem. One of the things though that I have to say that was challenging though was really trying to not fall into hero worship, to be quite frank. And I think maybe this is something that's specific to my story and with Haiti. It's because the story is covering something that only one company is doing in the country. So, HP and this plant that we found in Haiti, they are the only ones that are sourcing ocean-bound plastic, looking to recycle it and turn it into a finished product. Because they're the only ones doing that, it's easy to, take all their releases, see all of these positive points that they're showing and highlight that, and not necessarily have someone to compare it to another, let's say the government or anyone else that's doing the same work that we can kind of do a comparison with.
Yeah, I'll jump in here, Vania. I think it's interesting, this concept that we have oftentimes of that we need to create comparisons. And I think that's where evidence gathering is so important, is being able to say, okay, we are going to go deep on this one thing, and we're going to look for evidence of effectiveness of this, particularly for the community served. And I wonder what you've been finding. I know you're almost finished with your reporting and getting ready to publish. What did you find in terms of evidence of effectiveness, and what were the limitations?
So the main limitation with their evidence is that they're using a very small definition of a very small, narrow definition on how to be able to document how much of this ocean-bound plastic they're actually preventing from getting into the ocean. And essentially, they're just using whatever figures that they have that's showing the material that they're processing within their plant. But that doesn't necessarily give a full picture of what's not being processed and how that could be addressed. So that was one of the main limitations that I saw. Another thing is that there doesn't seem to be a real working relationship with the government, again, as far as seeing whether or not this is something that could scale. Again, this is one plant for the entire country, one partnership. A lot of the trash collectors that source this plastic to get it to the plant, they come from all over the country. So that was a major limitation, because part of my initial idea for this story was really looking at a solution that could scale in other parts of the country and not just be a regional thing.
Let me bring in Doug Fraser now. Doug, I think it's fair to say that you were a bit skeptical of solutions journalism when you first heard about it, and now you're using it when it's appropriate. Can you tell us, again, as your fellow journalist, what were some of the habits of mind, perhaps, that you have found yourself unlearning as you go down this new path? You're still muted. Hold on. Let's get you unmuted. There we go.
Didn't realize I had got that control. I was pretty much tended to sort of look at the solution as one of the last things you put in the story. I put the conflict up there. I mean, I deal in an area where there's plenty of conflict, especially in New England, commercial fisheries. I've been covering that for 25 years. It's about as intractable as it gets. And so usually you're putting the opposing sides up there, and the solution is way down at the bottom. And I've started actually looking more towards, well, where do these two sides meet? You know, sometimes that's hard to find, but I was in a meeting the other day and I was covering it, and it was not fishing, it was affordable housing. And they were listing all the reasons why affordable housing wasn't going to work. It was a bad problem. It was a big problem, and they had trouble, you know, with the idea that there was very little land left, and so it ended up pitting affordable housing against the environmental protection and open space. And the reality was that a program out there that where environmentalists and environmental organizations, realtors and others were looking at evaluating what open space parcels were left on the Cape, and where were the areas that could be developed for housing that wouldn't compromise the environment. So there was a group working on this, and unfortunately I buried it at the bottom. And in retrospect, I would like to have put it at the top. I've also started looking at how I use my quotes and sources. A lot of times editors really like it when they have a fisherman screaming at the camera and he's railing against the establishment. But, you know, I found that I've done that many times over the years, and there's a whole another group of people who work together. This will sound a little boring, but when you cover New England Fishery Management Council meetings, there's a bunch of smaller groups that contribute to the overall decision-making process. And they're fishermen, scientists, federal regulators, they all work together. And, you know, they go out to lunch together. They might even go on a boat together, for instance, you know, and I've seen a level of conversation and cooperation there that you don't see at the main meeting generally. And so, you know, those are areas where I feel like I need to go past the arenas where the news is sort of broadcast and get to the underpinnings. And I also have found that it's one of the tactics that one of the tools we've been being trained to use, which is to ask better, more complicated questions. And that's been a difficult thing for me. I mean, I asked, it's pretty hard to ask somebody, well, how do you think people are feeling on the other side of the issue? You know, when you're asking fishermen that, they don't really care so much, or it's harder for them to express that, you know. And I asked a woman who was she is the executive director of a fisheries organization that's in opposition to the wind farms. And I asked her, well, you know, what does success look like for you? I thought it was a little bit of a different kind of question. And she said, we keep fighting over the same old issues. In the end, they pay us money to offset, the harm, So, and it just didn't feel like a very much of a win-win or progressive question. It just felt like the same old standoff. And so I kind of felt like in that case, when I re-examined it, she's a woman leading a fisheries organization and there's been a few of those. And I felt like it would have been more interesting and maybe a different level of conversation if I'd asked, how she came to that position, what was her background, those kinds of questions. I didn't ask. I mean, in retrospect, I wish I had, because I sort of need that entree into different level of thinking than the old us versus them.
David, you mentioned that the editors oftentimes like those sort of explosive moments. Do you get pushback from your editors as you pursue a solutions approach?
Well, fortunately, my executive editor, who would be the person who would probably give the most pushback, is actually enrolled in the course, so that helps, But I wouldn't say so. I think they value storytelling, storytelling, of course, that is facts-based, not, and so I think that this leads to more complicated stories that are more nuanced, and I think editors tend to appreciate that.
So, Doug, you're also happening literally right in your backyard is one of the big stories now with this, what could be, or at least claims to be, the largest offshore wind farm in the US. Federal regulators just last week gave it the approval to go ahead. How you're going to be covering that obviously very closely. And folks, if you're elsewhere, around the country, around the world, and you're interested in what's going to happen with offshore wind and therefore meeting these kinds of climate targets, you might want to follow Doug's reporting on this. Doug, can you just speak briefly about how the solutions framework is going to affect and perhaps change how you approach your reporting on this story from how you would have done it, say, 2 years ago?
So there's two different stories I'm working on, and I'll just briefly look at the first one, which is it is the how do fisheries and wind farms coexist? And I've just sort of given you a little bit of a sketch of the confrontation there. But one way that I felt I could, one of the major objections is safety. Fishermen don't believe that they're going to be safe inside a wind farm with 500-foot tall spinning blades, and they're located a mile apart. I mean, a mile is not really a distance that you can measure in your mind. So I found out about this Maritime Simulator in Rhode Island, where they have an Ørsted wind farm that's already been proposed. It's all laid out on these giant computer screens, and they can actually take you through the wind farm as it would exist, and they can make large waves, stormy seas, rain, fog, nighttime, everything that you want, even large ships passing through and having you to navigate. And they have various vessels you can be on, like a fishing trawler, for instance, and you get all the parameters that would make it potentially difficult to navigate. I thought that was a good way to, an entree, you might say, into something that has really been a standoff at a distance, and I'm thinking I'm just gonna hang a story off of that basic story that will bring in all the other elements that are in play when these two completely opposed camps can't seem to find a solution, But to look at the jobs issue is the other story, and in that sense, I did what I would normally do. I went to, I couldn't go to Europe. I wanted to go to Europe, but of course everything was closed down, because that's where people have been looking at, where what the wind industry could potentially look like. It's a completely new industry. It could employ 80 or 90,000 people. And the first wind farm here is they're saying is going to employ 3,600 people. I could have just gone with truth testing those numbers, and I will. But I thought that, and that Fara and I had talked about it a little bit, and she made an interesting suggestion about looking at the auto industry in the South. And so I did look at that. There's a lot of similarities there between how the states in the South put up incentives, trained their workforce. They made it a good deal for the auto industry to locate in the South. First, the Asian companies came over, and then the US started putting factories down there. It's an industry that was built up from the ground up in the US. The problem with the Europeans was that I think I was going to get a lot of pushback, like, well, they're heavily subsidized. And it's different over there. Well, here's an industry that was built right here in the US and had a lot of similar needs, skilled labor force, land, a good location that the wind industry here needs. And so how will Massachusetts attract these jobs to its populace? How will they train their workforce? Where will they locate it? What kind of subsidies or incentives will they give? It was a good framework for me to basically say, not only this is how it could happen, but also, these are the pitfalls, because the auto industry is mature in the South now. It's been there for decades. And they found that the supply chain, for instance, that grew up around it, they pay a lot on a lower scale than the actual auto industry itself. And the offshore wind industry is banking on this supply chain to boost jobs and to make the industry, affordable. So all that has to be built up. And in the supply chain, at least in the South anyways, there were problems about poor safety training, injuries, plants closing, and what that did to the area that was dependent on them for labor. There's lots of good trade-off between the two. And so I really felt like in that way, and there's differences as well. So in that way, I could just it gave me a little bit of a framework to build a story.
That's Doug Fraser. He's with the Cape Cod Times. We also have Vania Andre of the Haitian Times and Fara Warner from the Solutions Journalism Network. We're going to shift now to your questions and answers. I first want to, though, alert everybody to a very interesting piece in The Atlantic. You'll find it in the chat box here, that a recent piece that will give you some background on why your newsroom may want to consider a more solutions-oriented approach, precisely because that's what the audience wants. They are tired of all of this. If it bleeds, it leads. If it's bad, that's what we're going to cover, and we're going to walk away. We're going to not be the guide dog that Fara talked about before. So let me start with two questions that just came in here in the chat that I think are really probing. One is, hey, it's fine for you to say that the solution itself is the main character, but doesn't that take away one of our main narrative tools as journalists, which is people? People love, human beings love to read about or hear about other people. So that's one question. And then the second is, there's usually multiple solutions to any one problem. So how do you decide which one to pick? And isn't that a question of bias? Perhaps. So let me throw the first one to Fara, and then maybe she can decide what to do with the second one. So the first one is, how do you take people out of the story?
Yeah, you don't take people out of the story. I want to be clear on this. What I'm saying is that you center the story on the solution. The characters, the people we go out and talk to, they're absolutely critical to this story, to the solution story. It's just it's a subtle shift in some ways. But what's important about it is that sometimes we can, and this goes to hero worship, a story is told through a single human being. Solutions include multiple people, many people, to make them happen. And I'd love, Vania to actually talk about that, because I think with you, Vania, right, it could have been easy to focus just on this one person in this plant, but this is, so I kind of like to throw it, Mark, if that's okay, to Vania to talk a little bit about how she's brought character into her story.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, so just like Fara said, the people are still a part of the story, but for me, it really was using them as a way to illustrate them exercising the solution, if that makes sense. to show the solution in action. And for me, it really was thinking about first seeing who's leading this. So, you know, my main character is the plant facilitator, but then also looking at the people in the community that he was working with that all added to this solution. So again, for my story, it's about washing plastics that end up as a finished product. So it was including voices of not only the people in the plant, but then also trying to include voices of the collectors themselves, of the mediators that help to connect the collectors and the people in the country with HP and with the plant specifically. So for me, it was really just looking at all the different components that were kind of working behind this engine to make the solution possible.
Great, thanks, Vania. I think it's really about the how done it, and you said it perfectly. It's like, and we talked about sort of following one of the plastic collectors and how powerful that would be in the telling of the how done it. How does this solution actually work? Mark, do you want to, what was the second question? Sorry.
The second question was about how do we pick among various solutions, and isn't that a form of bias potentially? And let me add in there another question that kind of dovetails with that, which is, what about sort of the racial, ethnic diversity angle on climate reporting? And how does that either overlap with or compete with perhaps, or perhaps complement a solutions journalism perspective on specifically climate issues? You know, the idea of, and I think you mentioned this, Fara, of looking for solutions in the communities that are most affected seems to be part of that, part of the answer there.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, bias happens in news all the time. From the minute you decide what you're going to cover and who you're going to talk to, you have created a sense of subjectivity. So, and other people might argue with me, and I'm happy to have that conversation. But what I would say is really, again, centering, looking at solutions where, and apologies, somebody's decided to mow right outside of my window. So centering, looking at communities that are most affected by the problem and are most affected by the solution, I think are a clear way of pulling away from bias and saying, as we know, and this goes to the racial equity point, is that communities of color, marginalized communities, often are those who are most affected by climate change, and therefore are most affected by solutions. And I think it is incumbent upon us to bring our, and you did this for the Covering Climate Now reporting week around Earth Week, is let's look at what's happening within communities, center it there. And so I think that's a way to, in some ways, remove bias, if you will. And then, yeah, there are always a lot of solutions to these big problems. We call it taking a small slice, right? Take a look at a solution. And I would say what's really important is there evidence of effectiveness? Can you show that something is working or not working, and clearly define its limitations? And then you know, always going back to the 4 pillars, which is what impact is this solution having on the community most affected? How powerful is that? So that would be my answer to bias, and then also focusing on racial equity.
You just said, let's take a small slice. Here's a kind of a pushback question to that from one of our RSVPs. What about problems of climate justice that are transnational? Can you bring a solutions framework to transnational kind of reporting? For example, the fact that under the Paris Agreement, the rich countries of the world have agreed to provide $100 billion a year, each and every year, to help developing countries shift away from fossil fuels towards green technologies and to prepare their societies for the impacts that are coming. How would you put a solutions journalism framework to that on a transnational basis? Or is that just not the kind of thing you can do a small slice on?
$100 billion is a lot of money to follow, and I would follow that money. How is that money ending up in a community? Out of that
Let
100
me
billion,
interject there, Farah. Part of the problem is that they're not giving that $100 billion.
they're not giving
They
it.
are obligated to, and so
They're
far
not
they're
giving it.
coming up with somewhere between $2 and $3 billion a year, which basically is coming from the Scandinavian countries.
So I would take a look then at those Scandinavian countries and see how they are solving this problem. What are they? This is a very typical solutions journalism story. How is one nation, how is one community operating and able to solve this issue? And can it be scaled or replicated in other countries? Because that then gives you the opportunity to go back to your country and say, if Sweden can do it, if Norway can do it, why can't we do it here? And therefore it allows you to hold your politicians accountable because you've shown that other countries do this, why not us? Is it political will or something else?
Mm-hmm. Here's another devil's advocate question. I'm going to throw this one to you, Doug, but everybody's invited to respond to it. Basically, it says, hey, well, yeah, maybe the public says they want solutions journalism stories, but then why are the readership numbers so low when we can track them on our digital sites? Why are they so low for those stories? So, Doug, are you finding that at the Cape Cod Times that your stories are getting, when you do use a solutions framework, that they are getting less readership than sort of the conventional stories would?
I can't say that. Well, to be honest, I'm relatively new to this, so I've been sort of just working on it now. My two big stories are probably coming out within the next week or two. So as far as, you know, overtly using solutions journalism in my stories, I can't say that that's something that I've tracked in any degree, you know, yet. Certain principles I've used, I don't think there's a story that I've submitted to the tracker, for instance, right now.
Okay, Fara or Vania, do you want to speak to that? Vania, have you noticed? I guess you're probably also still relatively new. You don't see audience figures on this yet.
No, not yet. However, if it's okay, there is a story that I worked on about 2 years ago that focused on mental health around the anniversary of the 10-year anniversary of the earthquake. And I only bring that up because I would say that was the closest that I've gotten to producing a solutions journalism story. And that did do well for us because that story really focused on the change of perception of seeking mental health after the pandemic and how that not after the pandemic, after the earthquake, and how that all changed. And for us, that was a story that did very well because our readers felt like they were seeing something that highlighted a solution that worked and that had longevity, that kind of changed the overall public opinion and perception of seeking mental health. So I think it really depends on the story, I think the audience as well. But for us, again, since they have been so used to this litany of negative political stories, that I think for us, it's a breath of fresh air when they see a story that highlights a solution.
Fara, can you speak to that question about audience figures?
Yeah, I think what we have seen, and you know, it's always really interesting. One of the pieces of the work that we're doing with the Business and Sustainability Initiative with Vania and Doug are both a part of, is working with all of our newsrooms to do better audience survey and engagement to really understand what is the impact of these stories. What does happen? Do you like them more? Do you like them less? So I think we are in a time when we are discovering what is possible with audiences when it comes to solutions journalism. As much as we've trained ourselves to focus on problems, we've also trained our audiences to expect that from us. And so in some ways, when you've got something that kind of comes out of left field, sure, that single story may not have done that well. And I think where we've seen the most power with our newsrooms that we work with is when they're very intentional about signaling that this is a solution story, that they are in serial practice with this, or they're in deep engagement where they're doing solutions day in and day out. That's when you can do a much better job of actually tracking audience engagement and how people feel about solutions journalism. But I think we're in early days.
When you say signaling, that leads to another question that we've gotten, which is, how do you write a good headline for a solutions story?
That was a great question. I saw it in the chat. We actually have an entire workshop where we talk about headlines, social engagement, visual journalism, because this isn't just about writing a 3,000 word piece, right? Sometimes you're going to be doing 800 words, or you're going to be doing a 30-second spot. In terms of headline writing, it's really, I would say, bringing the evidence, the most sort of important piece of evidence that you can, that shows a positive deviant, that this is working. So headlines that show where a solution is working, or where a solution has really focused attention on a community, a marginalized community. I'll take just a second. What Mikhail Simmons, who is in one of my colleagues, talks about a story that was done when I believe New York City finally recognized that they needed to put all of their health education information, it needed to be translated into the 30 languages that are taught throughout New York City. And that solution and how they did it and how they thought about it was highlighted in a story from one of our newsroom partners. And that was highlighted in the sort of light bulb moment of, if you want information to get to people, you have to put it in their own language, was literally signaled in the headline. So I would say strong.
So what was the headline?
I knew you're going to ask me that. I don't have it off the top of my head. You have to
well, of course I have to ask you that.
you have to take our headline writing.
We'll find that and check it in the chat, folks. We'll find that. But that's a beautiful example of a solutions kind of story that would work. Let me turn to another question here. And I think both Doug and Vania, this applies to the stories that you're working on. It comes from, well, I can't quite see the name, but here's the question. Oftentimes, the period when a response to a given problem is gathering steam and moving from idea to action is when that response seems the most newsworthy. However, at that point, there may not be a lot of evidence available yet on how well it is actually tackling the problem. So what is your advice for balancing the timeliness of coverage of a given emergent solution with the need to be rigorous about evidence? And it strikes me, both Doug and Vania, that's kind of the situation that you're facing now. So Doug, could you start with that? How do you balance that? You want to be ahead, you want to be on that story as it's coming out, but what if there's not the evidence there yet?
Well, fortunately, the beats I cover tend to be fairly data-driven beats. There's a lot of information, backgrounding information on the wind industry, of course, and a lot more is being produced every day. And there's a lot of organizations that are advocates for either side that produce their own particular data, and you just have to evaluate that. We've done a lot of scrambling in covering the wind industry because there's been a lot of twists and turns. And in covering fisheries, very data heavy. A lot of the marine beats are really data heavy. I just go to the usual sources because I've been doing it for a long time. I do know where they are, but at least in the environmental field, there's just a lot of data sources out there that you can get to that can help to back up what people are saying. They have their caveats. It's good to mention those, of course, and that's the only cautionary I would say, is that not all evidence is great evidence.
Okay. And Vania, I have to give you just 30 seconds on this so that we can close on time.
Sure, no problem. I would say for me, it's really about looking at comparisons. So for Haiti specifically, if I'm not getting the data that I need for that specific project, I'd look at other countries where they're doing similar work and see what kind of evidence that they have and what is the evidence that shows success there, and try to see how it can be applied to my story or to Haiti. And if it's not, then explore why that's not happening.
Very good. That's Vania Andre. She's with the Haitian Times. We also had Doug Fraser with the Cape Cod Times and Fara Warner, the Solutions Journalism Network. Thank you all so much. This has been such a powerful and inspiring session. I urge everyone here on the call to check the chat. We'll have all of these resources available. We'll send this out to you later so that you can share it with colleagues. We'd also appreciate it if you could just take 30 seconds after we are formally closing here to answer a survey about this talk and shop and which ones you'd like to see, what topics you'd like to see going forward in the future. And beyond that, we want to thank all of our panelists and all of you, especially our attendees. We'll be having more talking shops very soon. So come to our website at coveringclimatenow.org to stay in touch. And we look forward to seeing you next time. And in the meantime, we wish you a very pleasant day. I'm Mark Hertsgaard, the Executive Director of Covering Climate Now.
Thanks, guys. That was great. Thank you, Vania.
Y'all did great.
All right. Talk to you later. Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Magdalena, Simone, Lily. Bye.
All right.